Aerial compressors are designed for ease of operation and maintenance, as well as durability and long life. This training presentation addresses the removal and replacement of the piston and rod assembly for a double-acting cylinder. This procedure is performed when maintenance is done on the piston, piston rings, or piston rod. The piston and rod assembly must also be removed before maintenance can be performed on the piston rod packing. The primary steps in the piston and rod assembly removal and replacement procedure include removal of the crosshead guide side covers, removal of the head end head from the cylinder, removal of the piston and rod assembly from the cylinder, replacement of the piston and rod assembly into the cylinder, replacement of the head end head, replacement of the crosshead guide side covers. Before working on the unit, a note about safety. Ariel places a high premium on safeguarding the operators, users, and maintenance personnel that work on or come into close proximity with the equipment. Important caution statements are boldly displayed in the operator's manual as well as on the compressor units. Cautions, like the one shown here, will be highlighted when they relate to the various steps that are shown in the following demonstration on piston and rod assembly removal and replacement. The next caution alerts the technician that the compressor must be completely vented before loosening any bolts. Severe personal injury and property damage can result if the pressure system is not completely vented before loosening the bolts on the flanges, heads, valve caps, or packing. Another caution warns that the crankshaft cannot be allowed to turn by the driver or by compressor cylinder gas pressure during maintenance. On engine-driven compressors, remove the coupling center section or lock the flywheel. On electric motor-driven compressors, the driver should be detached from the compressor, or the driver's switchgear must be locked out during maintenance. Good maintenance practices for working on the compressor include maintaining absolute cleanliness, use of lint-free wiping cloths, and protecting the interior from dust when the heads and covers are removed. Components that have been removed should be protected from rough handling and falling objects that might damage the running surfaces. Gaskets at non-pressure positions should be carefully inspected before reuse and discarded if there are any evidence of wear or damage. Gaskets at pressure locations should not be reused. Before reassembly, apply an anti-seize lubricant to both sides of the gaskets for easy removal during the next maintenance. A comprehensive operator's manual supports every aerial compressor. Each manual provides all of the critical clearances, torquing values, bolting data, and special tool information required to properly complete each of the maintenance operations. The first step in the piston and rod assembly removal process is to carefully remove the head end head or unloader. Back off all cap screws 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters. Make sure the head is loose and the cylinder is completely vented. Next, remove the crosshead guide side covers and move the crosshead to its inner dead center position. If this piston and rod assembly is to be reinstalled, an important measurement should be made at this time. Remove one of the crank and discharge valves, and with a set of long feeler gauges, measure and record the clearance between the crank end head and the crank end of the piston. Do not use solder for this measurement. This dimension will be used to reset the end clearance during replacement. A special note before proceeding. Valve removal and replacement is the topic of another aerial training video that will be an important supplement to this video. Back off, but do not remove the crosshead nut set screws. and loosen the crosshead nut with the special slugging wrench. A special note about tools before continuing. In the following demonstrations, special aerial tools are used to complete specific tasks. All of these tools are available from Aerial, and most are provided at no charge with the compressor. These tools are critical to the various operations, and if tools are lost, broken, or missing, simply call Aerial for an immediate replacement. Use the piston turning tool with the B1240 support tool to screw the piston and rod assembly out of the crosshead. The two dowels on the tool fit into the holes in the piston nut. To provide a more positive connection, newer piston nuts have tapped holes to allow the piston nut turning tool to be bolted to the piston nut. In either case, now turn the crosshead nut off the piston rod. Once the rod is free from the crosshead, the piston and rod assembly must be pushed back to allow enough room to remove the crosshead nut from the end of the rod. Be careful not to drop the nut onto the slide surface. As the piston and rod assembly is removed from the cylinder, extreme care should be used in handling the piston rings. Despite their durability in service, rings are fragile when exposed and must be protected from nicks, marring, or bending. Move the piston out of the cylinder until the rings clear the cylinder, then remove the rings and the wear band. Once the rings are clear, a lifting strap may be positioned in the ring grooves to help support the assembly. The piston rod may now be pulled out of the packing and crank end head. The threaded crosshead end of the rod is smaller in diameter than the inside diameter of the packing. Slowly and carefully slide the piston rod through the packing to avoid any damage to the rod threads or to the packing rings. Before the rod clears the packing, grasp the rod inside the cylinder to prevent the rod from swinging when it exits the packing case. This step completes the removal operation. To begin the reassembly procedure, clean all parts thoroughly and check to be sure that all parts are clean and dry. Using a flashlight, inspect the cylinder bore for nicks, scratches, and surface damage. Aerial emphasizes absolute cleanliness during all maintenance operations to assure optimum performance and long life for the compressor. Any reassembly of used parts requires re-cleaning and re-lubrication of threads and seating surfaces. To maintain Aerial's high levels of reliability and performance, use authentic Aerial parts that identically match any parts that are replaced. Use of non-Aerial parts can result in decreased performance and reduced life. An example is the special rolled thread design of the piston rods to resist fatigue failure. Before replacing the piston and rod assembly, measure the piston ring end gap. This should be done both with new rings and when reusing existing rings. Slide the piston rings into the cylinder bore without the piston to measure the end gaps. Make sure that the ring is inserted well into the main bore and is not in the counter bore. Aerial recommends replacing the piston rings when the end gap has increased to 3 times new ring end gap. End gap dimensions are shown in the clearance tables in the operator's manual for each compressor model. Also, if wear bands are used, check the radial projection with the wear band on the piston. Since the wear band does not work as a sealing ring, the end gap is not critical. The amount of wear band projection beyond the outer diameter is critical. Refer to the clearances table in the operator's manual for this dimension. Aerial uses a variety of ring and wear band configurations, including a combination seal ring rider ring, and the proper end gaps, radial projections, and side clearances must be set for each design. Less than the minimum side clearance or end gap will cause the ring to seize in the groove as the part expands with thermal growth. Care must be taken that the threads on the crank end of the piston rod do not damage the packing as the rod is reinserted. An entering sleeve is not necessary but may be helpful. A non-metallic guide should be used from the crankcase end to guide the packing rings onto the rod as the rod is slid into place. If a new piston or new piston and rod assembly is being installed and the weight of the new piston or piston and rod assembly is different, the reciprocating weights must be recalculated. To maintain the correct maximum allowable unbalance, balance nuts and or crossheads may have to be changed. Insert the piston and rod assembly part way into the cylinder, stopping just before the first ring groove enters the cylinder. Install and liberally oil the rings and wear bands. It is important to stagger the ring end gaps around the piston rather than in line. Slowly slide the piston into the cylinder, one groove at a time. Take care not to pinch fingers during this operation. Care must be taken that the one-piece rings are fully compressed by hand and stay in place while the piston enters the cylinder. Place the crosshead nut onto the rod. Make certain that the crosshead nut is facing the right direction so the set screws are on the correct side. And screw the rod into the crosshead. If the same piston and rod assembly is being replaced, set the crank end piston to head clearance to the same dimension that was recorded during removal. To set the crank end clearance after installing a new piston or rod, remove the crank end discharge valve and move the crosshead to its inner dead center position. A special note before proceeding. Valve removal and replacement is the topic of another aerial training video that will be an important supplement to this video. To set the proper clearances as shown in the aerial operator's manuals and on the cylinder identification plate, first, measure the clearance with the crosshead nut firmly snugged up. If necessary, loosen the crosshead nut and screw the piston in or out until the clearance is correct. Tighten the crosshead nut to the torque value shown in the aerial manual. The same tools that were used for removal of the piston and rod assembly are used for tightening the piston and rod assembly. Tighten the crosshead nut set screws. Be sure that all of the turning and tightening tools have been removed. Replace the cylinder head gasket and head and tighten each of the cylinder head bolts evenly to the proper torque as shown in the aerial operator's manual. To double-check the clearance after installing and torquing the head-end head, remove a head-end suction valve, move the crosshead to its outer dead center position, and measure the head-end clearance. Caution! It is important that these clearances are properly set. Note that the head-end clearance is always greater than the crank-end clearance to allow for piston rod thermal growth. To ensure proper alignment and squareness of components, especially if any new parts were installed, the piston rod runout and the crosshead to guide clearance should be checked. Replace all valves according to the directions given in the aerial operator's manual. As the final installation step, replace the crosshead guide side covers. Then rotate the compressor to make sure there are no interferences. One final caution for a safe and successful startup. Be sure to complete and check off all items on the startup checklist in the aerial operator's manual and in the packager's operating manual. Two very important startup items are to purge the system of air and to leak test the valve caps and cylinder head. To purge the system of air, gas is introduced into the compressor by opening the suction block valve, and air is forced out of the system through the open blowdown valve. When gas is evident at the outlet of the blowdown valve, the system is purged, and the blowdown should be closed. Leak testing is accomplished with the use of a soapy liquid applied around the valve cap and bolts and the head and bolts. When gas is introduced into the cylinder, no leakage should be evident around the valve caps or head. If leakage is found, the problem must be identified and resolved. If the leakage is around the valve cap, the problem is probably a faulty valve cap O-ring that must be replaced. The problem cannot be corrected by simply tightening the valve cap bolts. If leakage is around the head, the problem is probably a faulty soft steel head gasket. Do not attempt to re-torque the head bolts with gas pressure on the cylinder. Before removing the valve cap or head, the compressor must again be completely vented before loosening any bolts. If the leakage is around the valve cap, replace the valve cap O-ring and re-torque the valve cap bolts. If the leakage is around the head or unloader, after the compressor is completely vented, check, but do not increase, the head bolt torque. If the head bolts were already properly torqued, the head gasket must be inspected and will likely require replacement. With the compressor completely vented, remove the head bolts and the head or unloader, and remove and inspect the soft steel gasket. If there is any question concerning the head gasket, replace it. After replacing the valve cap O-ring and/or replacing the head gasket and retorquing the valve cap and/or the head bolts, the compressor must be purged of air again by opening the suction block valve and forcing the air out of the system through the open blowdown valve. When gas is evident at the outlet of the blowdown valve, the system is again purged and the blowdown valve should be closed. Now the leak testing procedure is repeated. If there are no leaks, piston and rod assembly removal and replacement are complete, and the compressor is ready to return to service.